I'm Donna Eston, and this is 3 Needle Bind Off Purlwise. You'll want to use this when you're working with purl stitches on your right side. For example, joining shoulder seams for sweaters that have been worked in reverse stockinette or garter. This is what a seam looks like when you use regular 3 needle bind off. You can see there's a gap right in between these two pieces that's pretty noticeable. And your goal with seaming is always to have these seam blend into these pieces, which this doesn't really do. The 3 needle bind off purlwise blends in much better. So this is how you do it. The setup is the same as regular 3 needle bind off. With the right sides held together, we're working in reverse stockinette, so we want those purl stitches together. Needle tips point in the same direction and the same number of stitches on each needle. Insert your third needle knitwise into the first stitch on the front needle and leave it there. Wrap your yarn counterclockwise around the third needle tip to bring it in front. You're setting up a purl stitch, and we always bring our yarn forward before we purl. Insert it purlwise into that first stitch. Purl that stitch and let it fall from the needle. Take your yarn back around to the back. Lift this front knit stitch that's being held open over the stitch that you just purled and off the needle. So we have one stitch on the third needle. So let's do that again. You insert your third needle knitwise into the front stitch. Leave it on your needle. Bring your yarn to the front. Purl, back stitch. Take your yarn back around to the back. Lift that knit stitch that's being held open over the purl stitch that you just worked and off the needle. Now we have 2 stitches on the third needle. You lift the second over the first and off the needle, and 1 stitch has been bound off. So for the front needle, insert it knitwise and leave the stitch on the needle. For the back needle, bring your yarn to the front, and purl that stitch. Let it drop from the needle. Return the yarn to the back. Lift the front knit stitch over the purled stitch and off the needle. Bind off 1 stitch. What we're doing is we're knitting the stitches on the front needle and we're purling the stitches on the back needle. I'm knitting the stitches in the front, open it up, and you bring your yarn forward before purling. Then you bring it to the back before knitting. Bind off 1 stitch. But for the front, we go into the stitch as if to knit. For the back, we purl it. Lift the knit stitch that's being held open over the purled stitch and off your needle and bind off 1 stitch. What you're actually doing is you're drawing this purl stitch through the knit stitch. It's just easier if you think of it as lifting that stitch over top of the purl stitch. See how you're drawing that purled stitch through. back stitch, lift over, and bind off one stitch. Yarn to the back, lift, and bind off one stitch. If you forget to take that yarn to the back, you're going to end up with the yarn over. You'll have two strands. So if you do that, you end up with two strands, you'll know what you did. You just forgot to take the yarn to the back. And the last one, hold it open knitwise. Purl that last stitch. Yarn to the back, over, and bind off the last stitch. And when you're finished, you can see how nice our seam looks between the purled stitches. But you can hardly notice it. You can see how the patterning from the reverse stockinette almost continues right on across that seam. Let's compare it to the first one. Whoops, wrong side. Where there's quite a noticeable seam. The regular 3-needle bind off and the 3-needle bind off purlwise, much better.